right, hello. Welcome to the workshop for Disability as Icon, Framework for Understanding Who We Are. We are going to have a panel here with three of our presenters. The first one is Justin Hurt. He's currently a Master's in Divinity student at Holy Cross Orthodox School of Theology. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in Religion from the University of Georgia, and he has been a part of blindness advocacy consumer groups for the past 10 years. Summer Kinard has an MDiv and a Master's in Theology, and she's a Sunday school director at St. Paul Antiochian Orthodox Church in Katy, Texas. And she is an author of many books, primarily focuses on the disability of theology.
The other way around.
Theology of disability. Thank you. Okay, great topic.
Dyslexic.
And we also have Kate McCray, who has her MDiv and Master's in Theology and is the PhD candidate in religious ethics at the University of Toronto, and she focuses on disability ethics. So, welcome to all three of you, and thanks.
All right, I've got to wake my computer up here again, and then you can see our icon. Let's see. I'm Summer Kinard, and I'm the author of Such is the Kingdom, A Practical Theology of Disability, which came out in 2019. I'm also the author of Accessible Church School, which has a very wordy subtitle that I love, though. It is Incarnational Practices for Participating in God, because I believe that everything is for our salvation, of course, and so including Christian education. So today I am starting with this image that I put up behind our presenters here of the Holy Trinity, because when we say disability as icon, I'm going to talk about two aspects of that today. One, I'm going to talk about disability as martyrdom, but I'm going to end with that, so I'm telling you where I'm going. But the first thing I'm going to talk about is actually how everyone's in the image of the Holy Trinity in a way that perhaps you haven't heard very often. One of the big challenges with disability theology and with accommodating one another is that bioethics tends to be formed, and a lot of our ways that we talk about how to speak to other people tends to be formed by a notion of free will that is incomplete and that is only partially patristic, not taking in the entirety of it. So I am here today to give a little corrective to that. Yesterday I had a whole workshop on this, so I'm not going into all the details if you were at yesterday's workshop. But how we talk about being in the image of God matters very much to how we see each other as persons, including persons with disabilities. The image of God is the aspect of the person that seeks to understand and know God. This image is universal in all humans. It doesn't matter what level of ability or disability you have. This is contrary to models of care that assign value to people, that assign thresholds of respect, that assign usefulness to people's lives. That's not what we're talking about when we're talking about the image of God. When we're talking about the image of God, we're talking about a capacity that cannot be diminished. Okay. So one of the ways we talk about the image of God is as something that shows up in the intellectual faculty. And a lot of times people will just see this word intellect and they think it means intelligence or something you can measure cognitively. But it's actually a faculty of the soul. It's something that cannot be diminished no matter who you are. Everyone has this ability to perceive God. And I like to tell people, a lot of times when we're interacting with other people in the disability community, a challenge we face is of people who have more abilities trying to train or impose their will upon those who have fewer abilities. And that model is based on this perception of the free will being self-determination. And therefore, if you cannot self-determine, then you must be mastered by someone else. We're not going to be going with that model. So I'm going to introduce this other thing that's actually in the Fathers. Okay. But since we talk about trainability a lot, and a lot of the problems with that we have in the disability world of lack of community come out of people who try to impose their will on the vulnerable, people who are made vulnerable by their disabilities, or people who are not able to communicate easily. They use this model of training. And it's actually really, just like to go off script for a minute, it's very, very awkward to see those dog training buttons. You know, when people say, oh, I trained my dog to talk to me. And it's the buttons that were developed to help people with communication challenges. So they're used for humans. Humans started using them. But now people think, oh, it's easy to communicate because dogs can do it. I'm like, yeah, if it were just training, but that's not what we're here for. We're here for community. And so you have to have a community. And it makes me sad to see this, not because I think you can't train a dog, but because people will sometimes be so set on having community with their dog, but they don't take the time to communicate with people. And so it just sort of breaks my heart. But also, the corollary in an animal is not trainability. The corollary in an animal, if you're going to talk about intellect, would be more like imprinting. So it's something that's permanent. It's not whether or not, if you have a dog who can't push a button, he's still a dog, whatever, but he's loved and he has that imprinting of his people that he loves. And he also has an imprinting with his parents. So this automatic, it's innate. They just automatically do it. So I'm not saying it's just imprinting. Same for humans. That's the closest corollary in the natural world, not whether or not you can master yourself or master others. So the tendency is to take the idea of free will and substitute it for the Greek philosophical idea of autonomy or self-determination. But this is not actually patristic. We've sort of forgotten what the fathers were talking about, and we've sort of slid that older idea in to take its place as a placeholder, and it's very destructive. So the problem of self-determination means that a person that's community doesn't have any say in the meaning of a person. But what if the free will can't be free alone? And what if a free will is empathetic? And what if the free will is social? So what if the free will requires community and communion? And what if the free will is self-emptying, not self-seeking? And what if the free will is demonstrated not in mastery, but in community? And this is exactly what we have when we look at the Holy Trinity and Christ. The free will is not based on philosophical notions of autonomy, but on the theoanthropic nature of Christ, the incarnate Son. So we have the way that God is with us, okay? This is big words for that, forgive me. Okay, so free will is kenotic, it's self-emptying, and it seeks to communicate. And we see this in the Holy Trinity, in the mutual self-emptying and the mutual love, that pouring out, the perichoresis, this superincession of the Holy Trinity. We see their relationship. We have the distinction. We only know that there's Father, Son, and Holy Spirit through their relationships, but there's just mutual Godhead of love, and equal glory and all this. That's what we're created in the image of. And our will also is created in this image. So the free will-like persons is created in the image of God, the Holy Trinity. It's not selfish. The idea that we're basically self-interested is false. That's not something from theology. In fact, humans are fundamentally social. What's the first sin? The first sin is actually, God said, it's not good for man to be alone. So the first sin was they were alone. So it's not good for man to be alone. We're not fundamentally self-interested. That's something that came in much later to our thinking. We are fundamentally relational. And the human will that we are trying to talk about and trying to heal and trying to work together with whenever we're ministering to one another is fundamentally relational. Because of that, because the will is fundamentally communicative and not determinative. It's expressed through communion with God and loving others with God. It's not through mastery over others. And even your own self-mastery, like when we do asceticism and things like this, it still requires the goodwill of your community and your good communion with God. So we have to seek one another's good in order to have a free will. And this is why it doesn't matter how disabled you are. You can participate in this grace that St. John Chrysostom says. It doesn't matter what's going on with you, like what kind of disability you have. There's always grace available to the soul. Or like St. Paul said, nothing can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. This foreverness of God's love, this all-embracing, he's God. The whole world, he made the world for us. It is for himself, for us too, because he loves us. So we seek each other's good in order to have a free will. And in order to act out this thing for which we were created, which is communion. The last thing I want to say is, I just have a few minutes here, so I'm just going to wrap this up, is that disability is a type of martyrdom. So we're a community, and we're iconic, and whenever we seek each other's goodwill, and we become more like the Trinity, we live into our Trinitarian free will. the one that's in the image of the Holy Trinity. It's also called triadic. Okay? I'm not trying to say that we have everything in us that's the Holy Trinity. I'm trying to say this is the way we're like. We have to be together in order to truly do good. And our freedom is to love God, to cling to him in love, and to love one another with God, right? Then the last way that I'm going to set up before I pass on to Kate, is that disability is a type of martyrdom. And so we have the icons of the martyrs. Each person who is disabled, as a community of the church, whenever we embrace one another with or without disabilities, we are iconic like the Holy Trinity when we exercise our free will the way that the Trinity has made us to be. But also each one of these persons is a type of martyr. And so we can see this because when you are going through disability, you have the opportunity to recognize in your life not only the consolation of the Holy Spirit, which is like a sweet dew in the fire, St. John Chrysostom says, but also we have, sorry, I really love that. I got distracted by it. But also, we also get to experience the fact that all of our suffering is already Christ's suffering. So sometimes people in the world will say, or whenever you don't have this idea that God's with you, you will say, oh, how can God enter my suffering? How can he enter my suffering? Well, no, that's not how it is. It's his. It's all his. He took it all. It's all God's suffering. And so St. Cyril Jerusalem says, when you enter into baptism and when you go into the font, you enter into the likeness of his death, but he really saves you. And he really takes everything. You're entering his suffering, only the likeness. We can't experience the fullness. But the passion of Christ is in our lives already. He's with us in it. Whatever you're in, he's already there. So we've already heard this from others in much more beautiful ways than I just said it. But there you go. And this way, our wills, we become an iconic community when we bear witness through our loving and good-willed actions. So we're bearing witness, martyrdom, to God with us. And in this way, our wills, which are in the image of the Holy Trinity, become expressions of the love and communion with the Holy Trinity, within the Holy Trinity that we're drawn into through Christ our God. And one more thing I want to show you. And this is the eyes of icons. So I talked about this yesterday, and I think people really liked it. Whenever you have an eye of an icon, I'm going to draw something on the board, Justin, and I'll describe it. Okay. So I've just done a very bad drawing of an iconic eye. And the drawing has the iris of the eye touching the top lid, and the pupils touching the top lid. In icons, this is always how the eyes are drawn. The reason is because they're always looking up at us. So the incarnate God and the one who's higher than the heavens, they're looking up at you because of this humility and love of God. And this beautiful humility and love for one another that we see in icons, that is how we are supposed to be icons as well. So with that, I want to pass it off to Kate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Summer. So I would like to begin by discussing how icons figure. So in the relationship between icon and what the icon figures, that's typically called the prototype and the icon. The icon itself is a window. So this icon is a facilitated experience, right? So when an iconographer paints or draws an icon, depending on how you describe it in each tradition, right, or paint, that's a facilitation of our spiritual experience, right? We then use that icon to directly connect with who's depicted, right? We don't see the wood and the paint and the egg tempera. We don't see all of the gesso. We have a transformative experience and a direct encounter. So I want to emphasize the facilitation of that direct encounter in this presentation and talk about how when we use our language in moral theology, how we shape disability in moral theology matters. If we position disability as an outgrowth of sin or general fallenness, so when we talk about a fallen world, we categorize the experiences and knowledge and all the contours and textures of disabled life as negative. And in fact, we characterize it as the deepest negative we have in our theological expression. often disability is associated historically with sin. We do this through negative representation. We see it reflected in scriptures and healing narratives. We sometimes hear it reflected in ancient sermons or even modern homilies, where it might appear that a person with a disability serves a specific function. And that function is to be healed of this disability, so that the glory of God might be revealed through healing. Glorification of God functions in these healing narratives, in our interpretive mechanisms, in an awkward way. When we structure disability as a lowly state, healing functions as restoration and an uplifting of the person. God's glory is revealed in structure by contrast, communicating that disability is an icon of sin exists so that it might, by contrast, amplify God's glory through the alleviation of sin and suffering. Right? I think we're fairly familiar with this exegetical kind of formulation, right? My question is this how we understand God's glory? Is there anything in all creation which does not display the glory of God? Is there any height or depth, space within or without, any being or embodiment that does not reveal God's creative glory? So then, why must disability function as lowliness that Christ would say to the man born blind in the Synoptics that he was born blind to reveal the glory of God? Doesn't everyone made in the image of God display God's glory? And if this is the case, then the man's blindness also reveals God's glory. Several church fathers interpret healing narratives in unexpected ways. St. John Chrysostom interprets the healing that Christ offers to the community, not to the person that we might consider to be disabled. So Chrysostom imagines that it is the ignorance and hard-heartedness of the community which fractures the relationship between the social environment that we create and the person with a disability, which we functionally consider to be healed. But he does the reverse and imagines that the community's ignorance, hard-heartedness, selfishness, and egotism is healed. And he does this by emphasizing that in healing narratives, the person that we're describing as needing to be healed gets to go home. There's an alleviation of the suffering caused by alienation. So this alienation in what's called the social model of disability is described as disablement, right? It's the friction that happens between one's embodiment and one's environment. And of course, we understand, I think, probably more profoundly than most as Orthodox Christians, that the social environment is made by us, right? It's made by our opinions, our discourse, our theology, our belief, our practice. So this is a core component of the social model of disability, a model which positions impairment as morally neutral and disablement as the production of alienation and lack of accessibility. So this is where I'd like to really emphasize that facilitative quality of an icon, because we facilitate one another, right? We facilitate one another's spiritual and physical abilities, growth, progression, access. So for example, a person with a limb difference might experience a city differently to someone who's a bipedal walker, right? But in a society which supports a wide range of bodies, ramps will exist where stairs could be. In a socially mediated environment, we decide which bodies get support, and the bodies which are socially devalued are the ones that face blockades. Think through what it took for you to get to this room. You might imagine that if you are a bipedal walker with moderate vision and strength, that you walked into this room unsupported. In fact, your route to this location was highly supported and highly facilitated. Over 200 years of research and legislation has gone into supporting bipedal walkers. The weight of doors is averaged so that they might open with your easy push. The space and pitch of stairs are adjusted to your stride and average step. When you navigate a city without barriers, it is not because you have no need for social facilitation, but because your particular variable body has been highly supported. For example, there is a staircase in New York City that has one stair that is 1/8 of an inch higher than the rest. And like clockwork, people trip at that exact location. They trip at that exact location with dire consequences occasionally. And in fact, before the 1880s, staircases were not regulated whatsoever. So if you think of the stride and the pitch of stairs, this was completely unregulated and resulted in what in the Victorian era was known as stair death, which was often only those who were of lower classes in servants' quarters, right? Because rather than those large sort of like Downton Abbey staircases with a large stride and large pitch, staircases in servants' quarters were of an extremely high pitch and very unregulated. So each stair would be a different width, different depth. So we can see in this case of stair death that so fragile is human mobility that to not be supported in our material access can result in injury. And so highly facilitated is our social environment that one stair out of place suddenly registers the average body, whom one might consider to be fully able or normal, to trip, fall, and die. And this is because all bodies require the social and infrastructural supports that create access. So I'll leave you with that, but this is, I wanted to emphasize that we are actually a part of a human community when we don't recognize that we are. So walking across a New York City subway station, I may not be cognizant of how many hundreds, thousands of people have gone into facilitating my every move. So when we think about providing accessibility for people with disabilities, of manifold disabilities, we need to keep in mind that all of us have a variable embodiment, and all of us require social facilitation as a part of an iconographic representation, right? As icons, we represent this highly facilitated, highly socially interconnected context for the human being. That's how we're made to be human. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Is it really that good? Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Okay, that makes me think you guys think it's slightly good. That's good. A couple years ago, when I moved to Boston, I needed to get an eye report from the New England Eye Center to verify my blindness. It's a strange bureaucratic process. When I called the receptionist and booked my appointment, explained what I needed, she asked me, "Have you been here before?" "No." And then she said, "Well, how do you know you're blind?" To which I said, "Well, I went on WebMD, you see." And I didn't actually say that. It was very hard not to. What I did say was that I was born blind, and I haven't been able to see anything my whole life, so I'm pretty sure that means I'm totally blind. We want to love people that are different from us. People of different ethnicities, races, and ability. But how? It's hard, even for me, to love people that have different disabilities than my own. What are the principles that we need to use to love people effectively with disabilities. Just as Jesus tells us, be perfect, just as your Father in heaven is perfect. That's a high expectation. And yet, Jesus knows that by his grace, we also can reach perfection. Loving people means entering into their suffering, allowing them to take the lead, and having high expectations for them within reason. What are principles that guide this, especially for medical professionals? What can help you? So number one, we know what we need. When I go to the doctor, I may say, "Doctor, I'm pretty sure I have an ear infection. I get these all the time. It happens. I have an ear infection. Just give me the antibiotics. What am I doing? Just give me..." And he goes, "Okay, I'm going to actually look at your ear." And then, of course, he goes, "No, you're wrong. You don't have an ear infection," and he treats me exactly with what I need. That's great. Keep doing that. Please, don't trust my diagnosis. When it comes to our disabilities, though, we are experts. When I go to the eye doctor, what I'm looking for is to know about the health of my eye. I'm totally blind, so it's more like questions, is it going to fall out of my head anytime soon? Because it can't get too much worse than this in terms of my health. What I'm not looking for is life advice, right? How I should navigate the building, what career decisions I should make. That's not what I'm looking for. I know what I need in my disability, and I know what I'm capable of. And in light of that, trust us to ask for help. When I'm about to run into a bookshelf, let me run into a bookshelf. I know that's hard to watch, but let me do it. If I'm going to fall off a cliff, please pull me back. All right, I don't want to die or get grievously injured. That makes sense. Sometimes I want to get lost because being lost means I get to develop a mental map of the area. I get to learn about it. And sometimes I just want to try. That's it. When I'm ready to ask for help, I'll ask. It's okay to ask people with disabilities if they need help, but respect our answer if we say no, even if we're wrong. Because sometimes I do need help and I just say no because I'm still working on it. I'm still getting there. That's fine. Trust us to ask for help when we need it. Kate and Summer both discuss accessibility. Make things accessible for us. Expect people with disabilities to visit your offices, your churches. Expect us to visit your websites. Design things expecting us to be there. And again, ask us for what we need if you're not sure. Consult the disability community. What would make your office more accessible? Most of us don't go to the doctor for fun, right? But when you make it accessible, the information you provide, getting into your building, it makes the experience much less stressful. Speak directly to us. Many of us go to doctors with loved ones or personal care assistants. Speak directly to us. It is far better to assume that we can hear you and we can understand you and we can speak back to you than it is to speak to someone other than us about us. I'm 25 years old, right? I expect to be talked to like I'm a 25-year-old, not like I'm a 5-year-old, which has to do with also not condescending to us. Don't condescend to us. We're human beings. And this is a temptation that is, it can be difficult. But it's just something we need to strive for. If we're going to talk to someone, we need to treat them as they are made in the image of God. Ask questions. with high expectations in mind. Questions are good, right? You can ask questions about disabilities, but there are a few guiding principles that make it a more pleasant experience for us. One is, ask us if we want to answer your questions first. Most of the time, I'm willing to, but there are days when I don't want to. Just like there are days when all of us don't want to talk about our struggles. We don't want to answer questions. When we do want to answer questions, ask ones with high expectations in mind. So I'll give you an example. I have a friend who a couple years ago worked at Google. When he was in his Uber on the way home from Google, the Uber driver asked him, "Who takes care of you at home?" He works at Google, right? I think he can take care of himself. So a better question might be, first, can I ask you about your blindness? And then follow-ups like, how do you do things around the house? See, that question assumes that the person can do stuff. If they can't, they'll tell you. Another question might be, instead of asking us, how do we cook or do we cook, asking, what do we like to cook? Do we like cooking at all? It's the same question you'd ask anyone else about cooking, right? So I'm speaking about blindness, but this applies to all kinds of disabilities. So at a parish level, what does this mean in our churches? What do we do? Ask us questions at coffee hours. Kate spoke about alienation, and alienation of the environment. There's other kinds as well. I've been to many coffee hours where I've sat by myself and no one has talked to me. And I know that we do have this problem at churches with people that don't have disabilities, but as a person with a disability, it can feel even worse. When questions are asked, I just ask you not to lead with questions about the disability, especially if we want to house fellowship and friendship. Again, those questions are fine as the conversation goes on, if it's going well, but oftentimes when we're asked those questions first, we can feel like a new colorful bird that just flew into a cage and like, hey guys, look at your feathers. And it's not necessarily an enjoyable experience. For blind people in particular, trust us to ask for help means don't randomly grab us. There have been times where I've just found myself in front of the priest and I'm like, oh, I don't know how I got here. Someone just dragged me. They thought I was going to the bathroom, but here I am. So ask me where I want to go, and then don't randomly grab us. And another example of this, and this is serious, I make jokes about this because we have to, but when, think about a blind person, a blind veteran, right, who might have PTSD. If you grab a blind veteran with PTSD, you might be in for something. Like, I don't know, hang on. So it's, just like we wouldn't grab random people without them knowing that we were going to do that. So don't grab us, unless we're going to fall off a cliff again. Kate also talked about healing, and disability is seen as a vehicle for healing. So I'll tell you that a lot of Christians with disabilities aren't in our churches, and I mean our churches, any Christian churches. A lot of people aren't, because we are so worried that people are going to pray over us, and a lot of us hate it. Some of us don't want healing from our disabilities. I was born totally blind. For me, I don't think that sight would dramatically improve my life if I were to gain it today, simply because I have learned alternative ways of doing things. And if I had my sight, one reason it would be hard is I'd have to learn everything all over again. And that would be a lot. However, I did start losing my hearing at age 19 several years ago. And I would love hearing from that. I would love healing from that. Absolutely. So if you want to pray for us in public, ask us first if we want you to, and then what would we like you to pray about? And then respect our answer. I'm not telling you you can't pray for us in private however you wish. Absolutely, right? St. Paul tells us that we are to bring everything to God in prayer and supplication to get this peace that surpasses all understanding. That's fine. If you want to pray for my blindness in private, that is okay. If that's a part of your anxiety, that is okay. But in public, over us, is a different story. So, ask us for what we need in your parishes. As I said earlier, what would help us fully participate in the body of Christ? What do we need to enter into the sanctuary? I was at a church several years ago where, in order to get into the sanctuary, a couple parishioners carried this 70-year-old man using a wheelchair up this crazy steep flight of stairs. And that's how I entered the sanctuary. And I asked myself when I saw that, if I was a wheelchair user and that was my experience, would I ever come back to this church? And that's tough. I'm not saying any of this to condemn anyone here. This is hard stuff, right? I mean, every person with a disability has different needs. We have different worldviews. We have different things, and it's hard, right? If you don't have any experience around people with disabilities or much experience, how would you know any of this? So this is hard stuff. That's why the ideal of having high expectations is so important, not only for people with disabilities, but for everyone. A few last examples. When we're crafting a ministry for homeless people, it's not going to be effective if we don't assess what our community needs. If there's already a soup kitchen in our area that doesn't need our help, and the city is full of them, maybe we don't need another soup kitchen. Maybe we need to give homeless people some wool socks to protect themselves from frostbite in the winter. Imagine if in order to get to your job, or to your doctor, or to your church, you had to climb Mount Everest in January. That's crazy. Imagine if you went to your doctor and that everyone spoke English in the office, but also everyone read in Greek. All their communication was in Greek. And they said, I'm sorry, we don't provide information in English. You're going to have to get someone that can read Greek. That's our experience as blind people at many doctors' offices. And unfortunately, we can't often choose to go to another one. That's the only one. And we can't read our medical reports. So what this all means is, loving us means, just as Christ loves all of us by entering into our suffering with high expectations and allowing us to take the initial steps, and in fact, demanding that we take steps toward Him. So also, to love people with disabilities, we must love with high expectations and allow them to take the lead and enter into their suffering by putting them at the forefront and listening. As Dr. Philip Mamalakis always says in pastoral care, and it applies to everything, pastoral care is an encounter, and the encounter is not about solving problems. It's about loving persons. Thank you.
We have time for some questions now, if y'all would like to come up. If you have a question, if you could go to the microphone, it's here on the Mary in Heaven saint side there. I'm not sure what saint that is. It's Catholic. Yes.
I just want to thank you for talking to us about the blindness, because I do have a friend that recently became blind. And in our 20s and 30s, we were very close, and recently she came with an illness and she became blind. And I've always wondered, how can I help her through this? And, you know, offering all this stuff. Can I do this for you? Can I do that for you? Can I, you know? And it's good to know for me that I need to step back and just listen and allow her to go through this. And if you have any other suggestions for, you know, for me, as far as what else I can do to support her, because she seems to be isolating herself, that would be very helpful.
Is that okay, Ben? Thank you so much. And I just want to say, I mean, if you guys know people that are, you know, just, the term is slipping my head right now, so I'm going to say this in a way that might not, but the way, people that just have acquired a disability, if you know people like that, I would highly encourage you to direct them to local organizations, national organizations, specifically ones that are led by the people with disabilities. So for blindness, you know, there's the National Federation of the Blind, and there's the American Council of the Blind, which are led by blind people. And then, of course, the Vocational Rehabilitation Agency is supposed to help people with disabilities find their way back into employment if that's what they're ready for. So those are just resources you can use. There are tons of comparable organizations for the deaf and for wheelchair users and different things like that.
I'd like to just add one comment. For people with acquired disabilities, the transition from what they thought was an independent life to a more dependent way of living can often come with a lot of shame and humiliation. So I would really encourage you to do everything you can to acquaint yourself with lived experiences and stories, autobiographical accounts of that experience, and encourage her that depending on you is an opportunity for you both to get closer, right? To kind of re-up your relationship. You were close previously, right? You'll still be close. Give those sort of comments of reassurance, because I think when we experience transitions like that, it can be very displacing and isolating. And because of negative representations of disability by and large, people can often associate a type of suffering with disability as if it comes packaged with disability. When really, isolation and suffering that comes from isolation is housed in the fracture of the relationship, right? That's not a type of suffering that comes packaged with being disabled. That comes with being treated in a different way to what you expect and want. So those are just some sort of like guiding comments on how we can be more effective and responsive.
I want to thank all of you. These were really great presentations. I'm Gail Wallace-Jack. I have a question that probably is a little bit weird. I'll do my best to explain it. I'm Associate Dean of Graduate School. I end up seeing graduate students. What happens to many students, many people in their early 20s is that mental disorders start to pop up. And I have students that are schizophrenic. I have students that are bipolar, that have many disorders that the university tends to consider as disabilities. They get medicated and they don't, and sometimes they do fine and sometimes they do poorly. And I don't think that most of our programs are designed to deal with students in that type of situation. They take medical leave for maybe a year, 6 months, then they can't come back. They've failed oftentimes multiple quarters because of that. Do you have any advice for how we should be thinking of this, perhaps in different ways than we are at the university, and also in the public as a whole?
Yeah, I can say a lot about this. The way that this often gets talked about in higher education specifically, but other places as well, it's reactive. Oh no, they're here. Oh, it's a panic, right? And that's because what happens is we don't design our programs from the ground up to accommodate people with disabilities, people with different struggles. So when I go into a class, not Holy Cross, thank God, but other classes where I show up and the person goes, oh my gosh, my textbook isn't accessible, and what am I gonna do? And it becomes this whole thing. So this is a real complex thing where with any disabilities, I mean, talking about blindness, but many disabilities, the program has to commit to investigating whether or not these resources will work for a wide variety of people, and then not necessarily even a majority, but just thinking about okay, we know we're going to have students like this. We know blind students are going to show up. We know people with mental disorders are going to be here. So what are we going to do? What systems are we going to have in place? Starting there, designing it that way, and then you're good. And then you continue to adapt and as you go. But if you don't design things like that, you end up in a reactive place. And you're just going to react all the time, and all the time, all the time. And it's only going to get worse and worse. Because as technology advances and as things progress, the issue goes more complex because all of our systems are growing more complex. So the key here is to not react. It's to expect it to happen and then design accordingly.
Thank you. Yes, and this is what I wanted to add to it. Thank you for that, Justin. So I am an instructor and I am neurodivergent, and I am also an editor at a publishing company. And a lot of authors suffer with mental health problems or neurodivergences that have a lot in common with mental health problems, honestly. And so what I've done is put into place assignments. Whenever I give assignments, if I'm teaching a course, I will tell people, instead of saying, write a paragraph and do this, or and turn it in, or write a paper and just turn it in. I know that they're not going to have the executive function necessarily to do that. So we don't have a society that supports executive function very well. One of the things you can do is state your expectations, not just on the syllabus. And this is, it may feel to people who have so much executive function like they're babying someone, but it's not. If you give somebody a checklist, and then you can make the steps available, and then you check out the checklist, it actually gives them executive function. It's just how it is. That's how they work. And then they start to build that ability on their own. So as much as it may take a lot of work on the front end, if you could go through and say, instead of telling someone do a paper, tell them you have a weekly assignment of you have to comment on these 3 articles and you have to do bullet points. I went 3 bullet points for each one, things like this. Then they start realizing bullet points, that's a checklist. That gets past a lot of people's executive function problems, and it gives them something to focus on. It's just like doing something very short and breaking it down for them in your assignments is what I'm trying to say. Another thing that helps is, this is going to sound crazy unless you've done it and you see how easy it is. Give them the test ahead of time at the beginning of the class. Give them their final exams and their midterm exam. And give them all the questions. Don't just give them straight up. Give double of it. You're going to choose one of the 2 for each section. Give it to them ahead of time, and you will still get A, B, and C, and F students. Okay, you will still get the same fallout of grades. The curve will not change. People will still prepare differently, but the people who need that, they need something to study, they will. And so you've given them a support there. Another thing that I like to do is I do follow-ups on people. I give grace periods on when things turn in. So I expect there's a certain type of person I can spot them ahead of time when they come in, either as an author or a student. I know they're not going to turn in something on time. They're going to freak out the night before, absolutely melt down, make themselves physically sick. And this is a physical, this is the thing I think we don't always know. It's a physical illness. They'll start throwing up. They'll have gastroenteritis. They'll have terrible things happen to them. They may get dissociative, and they may go to a psych ward because they're so stressed out. They don't want to fail you. They don't want to disappoint you because they've got some baggage. So tell them ahead of time, listen, I'm here to help you learn. And if you tell them ahead of time, if you need more time, do not be ashamed to ask for it. And ask me, and the other thing that I do, and you don't have to do this, but I find it helpful, is I tell people, the week before the paper's due, if you want to show me what you have, and you can turn it in, or you show it to me, and I'll talk you through it if you want to. The other thing, if you turn something in and it's a total hot mess, and you really think you're going to fail, because a lot of times these people are just anxiety spinning, right? They're spinning it up in their head. I tell them you can rewrite it if you want to. Like, I'll tell you, if it really stinks, I'll let you rewrite it for like another 20 points or something, up to that. So I'm not trying to say you have to give all this grace, and I know that some people will be like, you can't give them. It really works. I've taught a lot of classes where I've graded a lot more than I've taught, where people having the exam ahead of time, actually, it works. And just giving people the freedom to say, listen, you're still a person and you're still worthy of learning, and state explicitly that if you have a mental disorder, or if you have a mental illness, however you want to, I don't know what all the language is around each one of the things. If you have an extra need, well then don't be ashamed to ask for help, because I'm here for that and I can help support you. Because the university doesn't typically. You have one professor and another professor and another professor, and it's so layered, it's very hard for them to, somebody who has they already have, it's not that they cannot manage mental load, because that's what we're trying to do when we pack these things on them. It's their mental load is already so high. We're breaking the camel's back, okay? This is what we're doing. They already have such a high mental load trying to function when they can't. So that's what I would recommend, is just do some accommodations. Like, make it accessible to start with, like Justin said, but those are things that have helped me.
And on a structural side, this applies to hospitals as well as universities. Post-COVID, a lot of agencies, like some of the ones that Justin mentioned, will offer what they call disability audits, where they will analyze the process and streamline, look through your syllabi, but also because of post-COVID, mental illness is now being categorized more and more often as a disability, as a psychosocial disability, which I think is of great advantage. So what this does legally is open up a lot more services for people who struggle with a variety of psychological or psychiatric conditions to disability supports, financially and otherwise. So asking the university to provide a disability audit from community members, and also if they don't have those resources, using that kind of more clinical language can often really go a long way to advocate for creating someone who can do a disability audit, or someone who routinely comes in to do that, maybe on a bi-yearly basis. Using that sort of language emphasizes that it's necessary rather than sort of a special, optional kind of thing.
Thank you very much, everyone. Informative, really well done. Kate, I need you to repeat what you said. You said, rather, disability is morally neutral, and then think about it.
Sure.
I can talk to you privately. Number two, your reflection that this building was actually built accessible. This is an accessible building. It's just accessible to some.
Right.
Right? And so the question is, well, who is it accessible to? To whom is it accessible? Reflects how people with different abilities kind of call us out that, oh, we all needed assistance to get into this building. This building had to be built for us to make accessible. And somehow the different abled kind of call that to mind. Can you speak a little more about how that the differently able, the ones with physical disabilities, call out all of our dependency, all of our need, and that there is no different thing. It's not that there's a difference. There's almost a reflection of what we all share. Just like we all need accessibility. Can you speak on that? Because I think there's a reaction from the able community to say, why do you call that? Why doesn't Justin want to be C? What's wrong? This is bad. We should pray over him. And there's like, wait a minute. And I think that your work in that area that says, here's why it's not bad. Here's what. Can you speak on that?
So
And thank you for your.
It's almost like Philip knows me or something. So my work is largely in Orthodox theology, focusing on dependency. And this is, kind of something we get squirmy about because we don't like the idea of being ontologically dependent. And yet, as icons of Christ, we have a dependent relationship. He's our prototype and we're the icon, right? We have a connected, dependent relationship built in. And so my research really investigates how all of us have dependencies. They're just variable, right? So it's not a question of whether or not you will eventually become disabled. All of us in this room, if we live long enough, will face a change in function. And so that variable kind of embodiment calls us to really recognize the ways in which we are really dependent. Unless you can levitate without stairs, you were not able to get to this room, right? Right? We live in a highly socially facilitated environment, and yet those of us who enjoy the privileges of being facilitated will drop that facilitation out of view and will create an artificial sense of individual autonomy, right? We create, right? We create, and really, like, we're amongst friends here, right? So Orthodox theology time. We create an idol of our own selfish egotism where we are the independent, right? And we're not actually being facilitated by others in our movements, in our spiritual accessibility, in our theologies. And one of the things I also like to say is that we think about accessible buildings, but we don't often think about accessible theology. Right? So we have belief systems that also say, hey, I don't want to change our church building. I don't believe that we should. That's a special needs option, right? And so, like Justin said, we are going to physically handle a person who uses a wheelchair and put them in physical danger to take them up the building so that we don't have to change the edifice. That is pure idolatry. We're taking the image of God, manhandling him up, all so that we can preserve bricks and mortar, right? There are some sneaky theologies that have gotten in there that convince us that that's acceptable morally, rather than looking at a body with impairments as the image of God, and to say that we have certain responsibilities. We're also not putting ourselves into a position of recognizing our own variability, that one day that very likely will be me, right? I can slip on the ice or have a stroke or have any number of extremely mundane things happen. Earlier, someone mentioned having a friend who went blind because of an illness. Like, illnesses are strange and bodies are wild. And so we don't think about ourselves correctly. We think about ourselves as fixed, as permanently abled, as ontologically abled. And that is not what the tradition reflects to us.
And blind to our current dependencies.
Yes.
Just because the building's accessible, we become blind to, oh no, I depend on that.
And the way that I might relate to this building today will not be the way that I relate to it when I'm 82, right? We're building structures that are inherently inaccessible to ourselves because we're failing to recognize our own dependencies. So where Justin's talking about being responsive to one another, asking, what do you need in this moment? Are you in the building where you want to be? Is there anything I can do to help? Being willing to hear no, right? All of that kind of responsiveness is also a working out of my own recognition that I would also like the same treatment. In situations where I need help, I would really like the opportunity to be humble and to integrate someone I trust into my process. And so when we recognize that kind of relationship, then it makes sense when Justin's telling us, make sure not to alter your language in a way that speaks down to someone just because they are embodied differently to you, right? It makes sense then because I also would not like that treatment. I can only experience that kind of relational connection if I recognize that my embodiment is variable and that my dependencies may be different. My dependencies are different than Justin's, but we are both dependent. Right? So then that creates a situation where I also need to express my needs. Listening to his needs allows me to be responsive.
Thank you.
We can do one quick more.
Probably not quick. So I'll just put this out there. I think this whole presentation was just beautiful, and I just want to say that first. I'm just so happy that OCAMPR is having this conversation, and I hope this just becomes part of OCAMPR regularly. Like this is so core to who we are. The question that comes up for me in this context is, kind of how do we navigate this dialectic between acceptance and change? Because we're all in the business of healing, right? And so where is it time to accept and where is it time to change, right? And this idea of like, I don't want people praying for me to be healed of my blindness, right? So it's really a question of like, where do we fall in that? And in the mental health field, you know, when people come into my office, they are struggling with this dialectic between part of me really feels like my identity is in this mental health diagnosis, and yet I'm here because there's so much distress, I want something to change, right? And so how do we respect that boundary between acceptance and change as we show up as healing professionals?
Thank you for that question. That's a really good one because we are all healing whether or not we retain our disability. So one of the things I say in my book, Such is the Kingdom, is we have to learn how to talk not about faith instead of disabilities or disabilities, but faith with disabilities. So we're having faith with disabilities. The other thing is that autism is physical. It's just invisible. It's a physical disability. I have 5 times more neural connections than y'all. And I will always, in every situation, be taking in 7 times the sensory input. I do not have a filter. What I do is because the reason I can talk to you like one of you is because I have math. I'm a very fast thinker. So I told you guys yesterday I'm a savant. That's why I'm able to talk to you because I cannot filter out these horrible lights that I hate. But I can say, okay, and I can just let that be part of the thing I notice and then do something else because I can focus, but I cannot filter it out like you can. Okay, so what I'm trying to say, it's still physical. I still have that, but learning how to bear what you bear as a cross, learning how to accept your limits is a sacred calling. Okay, when God made people, he didn't make everybody, he didn't say, okay, I'm going to make you guys and you're going to be, some people say he did it first. He didn't say male and female just in one big blob. There you go. Human is just one thing. He made male and female in his image. Women fully in God's image. Man fully in God's image. Why did he do this? Because we have a limit. We have a limit built into our society. From the beginning, it's a community with limits. I cannot understand what it means to be a male. You cannot understand what it means to be a female on some level. We cannot understand what it means to be God, and yet we're all called to be like God. And so these limits are sacred. And when you're born with a disability, as I was and my children were, when you're born with a disability, and Justin was, you have still a holy calling. But the limits that you have, in some ways, are more obvious. It's easy for people to forget that they have limits. And it's easy to forget that they're not meant to be overcome necessarily. It's more like classical music, they're meant to be sung in. Or like a church, they're meant to be the structure of the holiness. You know, that you can still modify and put stairs in or ramps.
Limitations.
yeah, but you have a limitation. So this holiness, you're healing, but sometimes me learning how to function, I guess you say, is what the language I use. I hate it because it's not really, what you're really doing is whenever you're accommodated, you can thrive, right? But learning how to be a quote-unquote high-functioning autistic person, but really what I'm trying to do is, it doesn't matter whether I'm going to match someone's idea of function. What matters is that I'm being who God calls me to be. And some people who are autistic can only be who God calls them to be when they're outside in the forest where they're not having all these things hitting them because they cannot filter it, they cannot manage it, and that's okay. But I can still be healed, I can still become holy. Because our goal is not to be like each other, our goal is to be like Christ and like God. And so I can still become like God. And that's where the spiritual healing comes in. And for some people, whenever you have a mental disorder, like I love what Father Stephen was saying, whenever you have these things, it is just the thirst for God. And sometimes there's like multiple layers of things that some people are going to have to live with a brain difference their whole life. So anyway, Justin, I think wanted to say one last thing. There you go. Thank you for that.
So first I just want to say, I know like this room is full of healers, people that want to heal. if you see someone with a disability like mine, and you feel, you're like, man, God, I wish he had his sight. You're not wrong for having those feelings. That's okay. You can feel that, right? Just think about that. You can actually feel that. It's okay. What does matter is how you act on those feelings. So if I come to an office, a doctor's office or whatever, the core question is, why am I there? If I'm there for healing, for blindness, hearing loss, whatever it is, then absolutely feed into that. Help me. That's what I'm there for. If I'm not there for that, then don't. It's also just a question of, again, asking, if you're primary care or something like that, and hey, is this something you want healing from? That's an okay question. So it's really about working with the person in front of you and not letting your feelings of wanting them to be healed control how you interact with the person. And a practical thing that I would say is, if you really want to help people with disabilities, allow consumer groups, meaning groups run by and for people with disabilities, groups made up of people with disabilities, to come into your office and place pamphlets or something. None of the eye doctors in Georgia that I know of, the main one being Atlanta, Emory, that works with blindness, they will not allow us in the blindness advocacy field to place pamphlets in their office. So what happens is, parents get told, your child is blind. And they say, what do we do? And the doctor goes, I don't know. So just think about that, allowing us to go in there. And also, again, as a doctor, if someone is diagnosed with a disability, you may feel like their life is over. You may feel like you have no idea what they're going to do. But don't tell them that. It happens all the time. It happened to my sister when my nephew was born. The doctor said, I don't know. I think he's doomed, essentially is what he said. So don't say that. Direct them to a place where they can actually get help. If there is nothing that can be done medically. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you so much, Justin, Kate, and Summer, for that incredible presentation. It was just so eye-opening to hear more about how to have been invited into that suffering, individuals with disabilities, and how to make our faith, our buildings, our communities, our persons more open to allowing individuals with disabilities to be more fully present in the body of Christ.
Communities with disabilities.
Yes.
You're not individuals. I think
Yes,
that's kind of the point we're making.
Thank you.
Yeah, please stop saying individuals. Because that's not a
Absolutely.
thing.
Communities with disabilities. Thank you.